Today we celebrate arguably the most anticlimactic event to be considered the central event of human and salvation history. Think about it. After all the buildup in all four of the Gospels of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, 3 times talking about how he must be handed over to sinful men and crucified and on the third day rise, and all throughout the Gospel of John, in which Jesus is mentioning over and over again, when the hour comes, when the Son of Man is lifted up from the earth. And now that time has come, and we are given an anticlimax. We're given a veritable cliffhanger. It's interesting these days when people often ask the question of the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Did it happen? Did it not? What do we really have in the Gospels? Well, first we have varying traditions and varying stories of people who said they had seen him. Not a single gospel tells the same story twice between them. Other people who had seen Jesus had gone forth to proclaim his resurrection, and the various traditions grew from those eyewitness accounts. You would think over something so important that they might meet and get their stories straight. I mean, even conspiracies often meet to get stories synchronized and in agreement so that they're not contradictory of each other. And that is what we have. We don't have that in the gospel stories. Various stories, sometimes very different from the others. There is, in fact, only one story that all 4 gospels agree upon. And that is what makes today's celebration of an event that is so anticlimactic. All 4 Gospels agree that they found an empty tomb. Not one of them gives an eyewitness first-hand account of Jesus actually coming out of it. But in all 4 cases, we have nothing more than the empty tomb. The closest perhaps we get in the Gospels is in the Gospel of Matthew, in which the women are coming to the tomb that day after the Passover and the day after the Sabbath, and they're wondering who's going to roll the stone back. It is at that point, as they approach the tomb, that they experience an earthquake. They see the angel of God coming down from heaven and pushing the stone away from the tomb. But then they run forward and look in, and Jesus is already gone. You don't get any closer than you do in Matthew's Gospel to witnessing firsthand the resurrection of Jesus, of him coming out of the tomb, and still miss it completely. It's a very odd and ironic approach that the church has taken over these centuries, and yet it constitutes the central feast of our liturgical year. Easter, the celebration of Christ's resurrection, is at the heart of our year and is the central focus of the message of the church from the very, very beginning. This Jesus whom you have crucified has risen. But no eyewitness, just the empty tomb. There are a number of ironies that we see in this event that touch upon our faith, that call upon our faith to make that ultimate profession in that faith in the risen Jesus. Not the least of which is what we've seen just in the last couple of years. And what have we heard in this era of COVID, in which we have been bombarded with themes of sickness, death, dread, fear. We've been told we must follow the science. We must be scientific. They remind me of Yul Brynner in the movie The King and I, if you've ever seen that. A word he uses time and again. We must be scientific, a scientific people. And we hear that and have heard that over and over again over the last couple of years. And what is at the heart of science? Observable data that can be tested and proven. But here we are today, with a feast in which no one observed Christ coming out of the tomb. No story in the gospel tells it of Christ coming out of the tomb. We have just the empty tomb and the promise that Jesus gave us. One might say that's not a very scientific approach in this era of science and the modern era in which we focus on science. And of course, I'm not going to knock science. After all, we wouldn't have science if it weren't for the Christian faith, and in particular, the Catholic Church, but that's another homily for another time. But what is the most important form of data in any scientific experiment or analysis? And that is data, experiments that are observed, recorded, calculated, and then those who make those observations teach it. But what is it we base today on? Why do we come year after year, century upon century, to celebrate this anticlimactic event of the risen Christ? It's not because any person witnessed Jesus actually coming out of the tomb, but because all these stories, all these traditions have come from people who saw him risen in glory. They saw him. The Gospels go on to tell us, yes, different stories, but all of them based on people who said, I have seen him, he is risen. Mary Magdalene had her experience of the risen Christ when he addressed her by name, even though she didn't recognize him at first. The men on the road to Emmaus certainly didn't recognize the risen Christ in their midst until he broke bread, and in that breaking of the bread manifested his risen glory, something we experience whenever we come to celebrate the Mass. The apostles thought they were seeing a ghost until he reminded them who he was and what his promise was. And when he appeared on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias, they didn't recognize him on the shore until that great catch of fish occurred. It wasn't just seeing Jesus, it was recognizing Jesus, recognizing his presence. They saw with their own eyes, and they recognized with an understanding that enabled them to go and profess that faith in Jesus. St. Paul says he was the last to which Jesus appeared in his glory, but acknowledged 500 others who saw the risen Jesus with their own eyes. And that became the foundation of the proclamation of the church through the centuries, from people who saw him, something that one can consider to be the best empirical data in any scientific experiment or process. First-hand eyewitness accounts. Now, one might say, well, how do we know they weren't fabricating it? How do we know they weren't making it up? It's because every last one of them went to their deaths, and in some cases a horrible death of torture, humiliation, ostracized from their societies, condemned by the religious and governing authorities to be put to death in humiliation, not knowing what the future holds for the early church. All of them went to their death proclaiming that truth that they saw with their own eyes, and nothing would make them waver from that. In an era in which people love to talk about how scientific they are, nowhere and at no time in history has anyone ever died for scientific discovery. We have that to show, to remember, to profess, and to believe as we come together to celebrate perhaps a very anticlimactic telling of this story. Jesus shows up nowhere in today's gospel, and that's the point. He's missing. The tomb is empty. Where is he? But as people of faith who have put that faith on centuries of proclamation based upon people who saw him with their own eyes, we come forth and declare he is risen. Based on the example of century upon century of people who gave their own lives for that truth, in which nothing, not even the preserving of their own lives, would make them waver from that faith, from that evangelization, and from that proclamation, we come forth to proclaim the same. We come forth with people who are given a story, but then, in many ways, are asked of ourselves, after all this build-up, after all this preaching that Jesus gave and teaching of the kingdom and what was in store for him as the Son of God and our Messiah, all we are given is a cliffhanger, an empty tomb, and a question of where is he? It's almost as if down through the centuries, the evangelists are looking at each and every one of us who come to celebrate on this day and who hear again this story of the empty tomb. Where do you think he is? What do you think became of him? What do you profess with your faith? What do we truly believe when we claim and come forth to celebrate on this day that Christ is risen? Do we need to hear the story of him coming out of the tomb? I think we have that image in our minds already, not because the story tells us of it, but because of what has been proclaimed by those who saw him with their own eyes, heard him with their own ears, sat and ate with him in his presence, and bore witness to the great truth and that great triumph that Christ is risen. That message has gone forth for 2,000 years based on eyewitness account. Countless people have lived, many people have given their lives for that truth. Let us go forth to participate in that great tradition, in that great process, in that great profession of our faith, as we continue to pass that faith on down from one generation to the next, from you to your children and your children's children. We come forth here to worship God in this cathedral on this great, high, holy day of the year, not to profess an anticlimactic event, even if we are given an anticlimactic story. Because we come forth with this faith, and let us, in this Eucharist, profess that faith. Let us, in this Eucharist, experience, again, the presence of the risen Lord, so that we can come forth and say, yes, he is risen. We have seen him. We have seen him in the breaking of the bread. We have seen him in the gathering and worship of the community. We have seen him and we hear him in the profession of the word that we hear and proclaim in the Mass. And we go forth as a people of the resurrection and of the people of that great faith. We go forth to our world that turns to other values, other systems, whether scientific or otherwise, to unwaveringly continue to proclaim, we have seen him, we have heard him, he is with us, he is risen.